Hi there. This is the sermon video for May the 17th. It is the 8th Sunday of our lockdown, and it is also Victoria Day here in Canada. The question I'm going to ask you for the sermon ahead of time is this. If someone were to follow you around for a day, walk through your home, observe your daily rituals, and they would conclude afterwards that you are very religious, would you hear that as a good thing or as a bad thing? Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 31. Paul stood up in the middle of the council on Mars Hill and said, "People of Athens, I see that you are very religious in every way. As I was walking through town and carefully observing your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What you worship as unknown, I now proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, is Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't live in temples made with human hands, nor is God served by human hands as though he needed something, since he is the one who gives life and breath and everything else. From one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. God made the nations so they would seek him, perhaps even reach out to him and find him. In fact, God isn't far away from any of us. In God we live, move, and exist. As some of your own poets said, we are his offspring. Therefore, as God's offspring, we have no need to imagine that the divine being is like a gold, silver, or stone image made by human skill and thought. God overlooks ignorance of these things in times past, but now directs everyone everywhere to change their hearts and lives. This is because God has set a day when he intends to judge the world by a man who he has appointed. God has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead." In my university days, when I would visit home, my brother and I would often go to the local Tim Hortons to hang out with his friends. And when I wasn't there, he went with his friends by himself many times. And it became a kind of a habit, a pattern. He was there every night of the week sometimes. So much to the point where some of us, mostly his sisters, would communicate their concerns to him. They thought it was a destructive pattern, an addictive pattern even. And he told them it wasn't a big deal. Well, it happened one week that one of his friends was sick, one of them was traveling, and one of them was extra busy with work, so for a little while it would just be him, and he decided he didn't need to go, and he could prove that in fact he wasn't actually addicted. Well, what happened was he stayed home and thought everything would be fine. Well, at 9 o'clock, when he would normally be getting a sip of that coffee, which he told himself and others that he didn't actually like, his body started to give him the shakes. And he started to realize that in fact this habit that he had formed was addictive. He, in his mind, didn't think that he was, but his body told him otherwise. In today's scripture passage, the Apostle Paul is wandering through the city of Athens, and what he finds is a very religious people, and he tells them so. And that's a tricky word in our vocabulary, and I think theirs too. What exactly is included in that? What did Paul see that brought him to that conclusion? Did his audience receive this favorably or not? So now all of us are washing our hands religiously. A lot of us still buy our coffees religiously, like my brother and I were doing. There are things that we do based on a pattern, and outside observers might want to call that religion. And there was a lot in Athens that Paul looked at and was troubled by, distressed by. And what he saw was also unfamiliar to him, unfamiliar to his experience. He was, of course, brought up Jewish, trained and educated in Jewish religious systems. And so, based on his understanding of the Ten Commandments, you couldn't make a graven image of the God that you were worshiping. And he would have seen all of the statues, a lot of those rituals would have been unfamiliar to those experiences. And yet he did find one thing that probably, I think, looked very familiar to him. There was a statue that had in the inscription, "To an unknown God." Now, in Hebrew, you couldn't write the name of God. It was understood to be sacred, and so even to put it on paper would be to defame it, to take away some of the sacredness of the name. So here was a statue, and the inscription said, "This is a God we cannot name, we cannot understand." And the Jewish religious scholars are much more comfortable arguing and debating and living in that space in between. Ever since Jacob wrestled with God and God celebrated that, Jewish religious leaders lived in that space of knowing and unknowing. Well, the audience then was presented with an idea that this unknown God was the one that Paul worshipped. Paul says, "What you worship, I now proclaim to you." An interesting statement. This is happening on Mars Hill in front of the Areopagus, and these words actually mean the same thing. Areopagus from the Greek, meaning the hill of Ares, and Mars, the Roman equivalent of Ares. So Paul is speaking to this audience in this place, and what he was doing was using their own religious systems to talk about his own first. What he was doing was using their religious understandings, their cultural ways of doing things, and using that as a way to tell them about Jesus, about his understanding of the supernatural. Well, this happened on Mars Hill. And we have two famous examples of churches who were so inspired by this way of doing things that they called themselves Mars Hill Church. One of them was in Michigan a little while ago. A charismatic pastor by the name of Rob Bell wanted to use this as a template and used cultural examples all the time, and in his presentation was eager to say, listen, there's a whole lot of stuff of what the world around us is doing where we can find God. There's another example on the other side of the country in the state of Washington. Another pastor, charismatic and gifted in a lot of ways, Mark Driscoll, wanted to do the same thing. And he wanted to use society's interest in various topics and twist that into an interest in God. Both of them were very successful. Both churches grew to be quite large. And while now both pastors are not there, both involved in scandals of their own kind, the question remains: how much of the worship and the curiosity of our society is actually something that is an interest in God? I asked the question earlier, if somebody were to follow you around to watch your daily routines and rituals, would they see that you were religious? And if they said that, would they mean it as a good thing, and would you hear it as a good thing? Paul uses this explanation to tell his audience that they are religious. Maybe some of them didn't think they were. Maybe they thought they were academics. Many of us don't think that we are religious in the sense that we're bound to empty routines. But we follow the same rituals and routines, the ways that we shop, the shows that we watch. We follow patterns because we are pattern-making people as individuals. But Paul's comments, I think, should be a challenge to us as well. It's really easy to look at this story and to dismiss the people of Athens as being quaint and old-fashioned. It's easy to write them off as simplistic, with a simplistic religion. And when we read this as inheritors of the religion that Paul was teaching, it's easy to think that we're on the good side of this. But if we do that, then we miss the challenge. Paul tells the people that they shouldn't worship a God who needs to be served. The God that he was telling them about didn't live in those human buildings and didn't need people to serve them. In fact, that God was himself oriented towards service. So within this pandemic, where a lot of us are freaking out over things that aren't going to survive, but the challenge is, I think, to also ask those institutions, are they worth protecting? So we believe that we worship a God who serves us, and so then we participate in that life rather than serving out of empty devotion and religious expectation. But there are also institutions that we are propping up with our energy, with our gifts. And so then we need to ask ourselves, are we pouring money into worshiping a God that needs to be served by us? There have been a lot of people who have looked at the ways that we interact with the market and said, this looks an awful lot like a religion. And so the market is what we use to determine if a business idea is good or not, even if a charity is worth giving to or not. Are they participating in the market? Is the market helping them or hurting them? Because the market will determine what is good and what is bad. And so now we see that the market is struggling. And a lot of the pressure that we're getting from government and from commercials is that we need to continue to prop up the market. Now, certainly what we need to do is support people. There are people who are working in restaurants who've poured their hearts into those businesses, and we need to honor that. We need to honor the farmers who have grown our food. We honor the people who clean the buildings that we use. But are we honoring the people or are we honoring the market? The challenge to the Athenian religious system, we are too far removed to even fully understand that, but we are close enough to our own systems to put the challenge to that. A lot of the world that we are living in that requires our energy, that requires our money, that requires our devotion, these are systems that were created with human hands, and they are not worthy of that endless, unquestioned desire. So Paul's challenge to the Athenians is Paul's challenge to us. Are we pouring our hopes, our energy, our devotion into something that will only rob us, that won't give back? The challenge is to us, and it is to those institutions, including religious institutions like ours. What this pandemic has done is really thrown all of our rituals and routines into the mixer. And so many of us have had to choose between finding a new way of doing the old things. So we in our church, all of the other churches I know, other religious groups, continue to gather and study and learn and serve together in all the ways that they had before, but now digitally, now at a distance. A lot of other people are finding that they need to reevaluate why they were doing what they were doing before, to see if that's something that needs to continue. And even when things go back to normal, whatever that word means now, we're going to find that a lot of routines that people were doing are not going to continue, because this has given them an opportunity to evaluate if it was good or bad. Paul speaks a lot about this unknown God, a God that exists beyond the creation of human hands, a God that lives outside of human temples, outside of human patterns of behavior. This is the God that we worship, a God not one that we have created with our hands, but a God who created us with his hands. there is a lot that we are missing about the way that things were before. And it isn't just us within the church. All around us, our neighbors, the people who live in this city and in the country with us, all of us are feeling a loss of what we had before. And obviously we are feeling the loss of money as employment dries up, as investments devalue. All of those adjustments will take some time. And they are not easy or comfortable adjustments to make. All of us are making those adjustments, and all of us feel a loss for what we had before. Now, we in the church feel a loss of our ability to gather, and we contemplate what gathering will look like in the next while. But as we look around us, our friends and neighbors are feeling that loss as well. So the people of Athens had erected this statue to fill a void, to acknowledge that the patterns that they had left something out, that there was a yearning that was unfulfilled. And this was Paul's building point. We still have yearnings that we have unfulfilled, and the world around us is still yearning for a connection. And not all of it is going to be a connection in buildings like ours. But God has created us with a yearning to be together, some more than others. But that connection with other people is a yearning, I believe, comes from our Creator, comes from the God who wants us to be together. The people of Athens yearned for a little bit more than they had, and so they had this extra statue to cover that. We have a yearning for more than what we have. And so we recognize the pain and the difficulty of this situation, but we also turn our minds towards what is good, what we want to accomplish. So Paul challenged the people and told them that they should worship a God not made by their hands, that they should worship a God who was above all of that. But I think he's also pointing out, you are already yearning for that. You are already reaching out for that. So this is my challenge for you, to continue your yearning, to continue your reaching out for God, knowing and trusting that he is also reaching out to us. But the other challenge is the same, builds on the same idea that there's a God who is reaching out to us, and there's an internal yearning in us, in and outside of the church, to reach out to something more. And so while we are reaching out for something more, we will also see our friends and neighbors doing that, and to reward and participate in that with them. Our friends and neighbors are also reaching out to an unknown God, and it is up to us to reveal who that God is and the beauty of living in relationship with him. Thanks for tuning in today.